Have you ever wondered how certain objects cross time without belonging to it? In silent excavations beneath layers of earth that hold millennia of oblivion, archaeologists find artifacts that seem out of place in history itself, parts that they shouldn't exist there, objects that defy dates, techniques, and consensus. How if someone, at some remote point in the past, had left a message out of place, waiting to be found again? These findings don't scream, they whisper, and maybe that's why they're so uncomfortable. Because they don't arrive with ready answers but with questions that corrode certainties. They challenge the linear narrative that we learned at school, the one that says that humanity evolved in predictable steps, always from simple to complex, from crude to refined. But what if this story is incomplete? What if ancient civilizations knew more than we realize? In different parts of the world, objects appear in impossible contexts, metals where they should not exist, sophisticated mechanisms buried in eras considered primitive, structures that would require calculations that were too advanced for their official time. When these objects come to light, something curious happens. The silence. Reports are filed, hypotheses are smoothed over, and what doesn't fit is labeled as an anomaly. Not because it was understood, but because it bothers me too much. Because accepting these discoveries would require reviewing not just dates, but perception itself of who we are and where we come from. There is something deeply human about this discomfort. We have always sought security in the narratives that explain us. They work like indoor maps. But when an impossible object appears, this map fails. The compass spins, and we are invited to face an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the past is much more complex, intelligent, and mysterious than we dare admit. This video is an invitation to this journey. Not to deny science, but to expand it. To look at archaeological finds just like museum pieces, but like mirrors. Mirrors that reflect an ancient humanity perhaps more awakened, more connected, more daring than the books they usually show. If you feel, silently, that certain things are not just coincidence, maybe this is time to listen more carefully. Allow yourself to stay. Allow yourself to question. Because some mysteries don't arise to be immediately resolved, but to remember something that the soul recognizes before the mind. Along this path, you will discover objects that defy simple explanations, artifacts that seem to cross eons like seeds thrown through time. And the question what remains is not just how they were made, but why. What do they still try on us, say, if we are willing to listen? Take a deep breath, because the journey has just begun, and the next step could change everything you believe about the past, more than you imagine. Carefully. In 1901, Greek divers explored the wreckage of an ancient ship sunk in the sea, Aegean Sea, when they found something that didn't make any sense. Among broken statues and amphorae corroded by salt, a fragmented block of bronze emerged, taken for very fine gears. At first glance, it just looked like a pile of bare metal. Value. But that object, silent and oxidized, carried a secret that would only begin to unfold, be understood decades later. When the fragments were analyzed more closely, the researchers realized something disturbing. This was not a sculpture, nor an ordinary tool. It was a mechanism, a complex system of cogwheels, axles, and microscopic inscriptions. Over time, X-ray examinations revealed more than 30 interconnected gears with mathematical precision. The object came to be known as the Antikythera mechanism. Science was silent for a moment, because that artifact was dated more than 2,000 years ago. According to everything that was believed until then, mechanisms of this level of sophistication would emerge in medieval Europe. More than 1,000 years later, astronomical clocks, calculations of celestial cycles, eclipse predictions, all of this theoretically would belong to an era much later. And yet, here was material proof that someone in the ancient world mastered differential gears and advanced astronomical calculations. Scientists discovered that the mechanism was capable of predicting solar and lunar eclipses, follow the movement of the planets known at the time, and even calculate Olympic cycles. It wasn't just a tool. It was an analog computer, the first in history according to many researchers. But this conclusion brought more disquiet than relief. If this level of knowledge existed, where was it hidden? Who built it? And why does this knowledge seem to disappear soon after? The official narrative tried to resolve the discomfort by calling the object an Isolated case. One genius lost in time. An unlikely exception. But exceptions don't come out of nowhere. Technology does not flourish in a vacuum. For an artifact like that to exist, it was an advanced intellectual environment, mathematical tradition, transmission of knowledge, and above all, continuity. However, this continuity does not appear in known historical records. It's as if an entire library had been erased, leaving only a single book burned by the half. The Antikythera mechanism doesn't fit because it suggests something bigger, a peak of knowledge that shouldn't be there, followed by profound forgetfulness. This type of finding forces us to look at the past with more humility. Perhaps human history is not a straight upward line, but a series of waves, civilizations that flourish, reach high levels of understanding, and for reasons that we still don't fully understand, they collapse. Wars, natural disasters, climate change, or simple cultural erasure may have swallowed entire knowledge. And here comes the most disconcerting reflection. If a single object managed to cross time and reach us almost by accident, how many others didn't arrive? How many mechanisms, maps, instruments, and ideas have been lost forever? How many remain buried, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right place? The Antikythera mechanism is not just an archaeological curiosity. He is a reminder, a metallic whisper from the past saying that perhaps we have underestimated our ancestors, that human intelligence is not a privilege of modernity, and that the knowledge can be as fragile as it is powerful. When you look at this object, you're not just looking at an old gear. It is facing the possibility that the story we tell about ourselves is just a simplified version, a comfortable story, but incomplete. What if this is not an isolated case? What if other impossible objects are scattered around the world, waiting to reveal that the past knew much more than we are ready to accept? Perhaps the next find will make this question impossible to ignore. In 1936, on the outskirts of Baghdad, a seemingly simple find began to disturb archaeology. At a site near the ancient site of Kujut Rabu, archaeologists, they found a small clay pot, nothing that caught your attention at first glance. But inside it there was a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and traces of a substance acidic. Separated, they were just common materials. Together, they formed something unexpected. Decades later, when the object was studied more carefully, the hypothesis emerged that nobody wanted to say it out loud. It worked like a battery. One-cell primitive electrochemistry, capable of generating electric current. The artifact became known as the Battery of Baghdad, and suddenly, the past took on an unsettling glow. The dating suggested that the object could have been manufactured between 200 BC and 200 AD, during the birth period. The problem was simple and profound at the same time. The official story states that electricity only began to be understood and applied scientifically in the 18th century. Before that, there were no wires, engines, or theories. But there was one device that, when filled with vinegar or fermented grape juice, produced a small measurable voltage. The tests left no doubts. Modern replicas, built with the same materials, generated electricity. Little, it's true, but enough to provoke reactions chemicals. And this raised a perplexing question. Why would anyone need electricity 2,000 years ago? Some have suggested that the battery could have been used for galvanizing, a process of metallic coating. This would explain certain ancient artifacts covered in very fine layers of gold, so uniform that they appear to be applied with modern techniques. Others proposed ritual uses, perhaps to create mild shocks in religious ceremonies, interpreted as divine manifestations. And there are those who argue that the object did not even have electrical purpose, being only a symbolic container. But here's the crux. Form follows function, and that combination of copper, iron, and acid does not appear by chance. It reveals intent, empirical knowledge, experimentation. Even though the ancients did not understand electricity as we understand it today, they could know that that combination produced an effect, an invisible force, one repeatable phenomenon. Science, after all, is not born ready-made. It starts as curiosity, trial, error, and observation, exactly as humanity has always done. Still, the object remains in a gray area. Many textbooks, they only mention it in passing, if at all. Others ignore it completely. He is too uncomfortable to fit into the comfortable narrative of a past technologically naive. And this leads us to deeper reflection. How many ancient discoveries have been reinterpreted or simply discarded just because did not fit the accepted model? How many artifacts were classified as rituals just because its practical function seemed impossible for its time? The Baghdad Battery forces us to accept that human knowledge may have arisen from non-linear ways. What ideas may have appeared, disappeared, and reappeared centuries later under new names? Electricity, in this context, would not be an invention modern, but a rediscovery. There is something poetic about this. Imagine ancient hands, experimenting with metals, liquids, observing reactions without knowing explained theoretically what they saw, but learning from experience. A science silent, without equations, but deeply functional. And perhaps most disturbing is this. If we accept that electricity was known, we still that in a rudimentary way we need to reevaluate other capabilities of the ancient world. Lighting, medical treatments, preservation techniques. Each possible answer opens 10 new questions. The Baghdad Battery does not scream technological revolution. It whispers human continuity. The same curiosity that today drives laboratories and universities was already pulsing in civilization's old ones. He just expressed himself in another way. And if this small clay vessel managed to cross time carrying a secret so powerful, how many other similar objects have not been broken, melted, or forgotten? How many sparks from the past were extinguished before they were seen? Maybe the next impossible object doesn't involve gears or electricity. Perhaps it touches on something even more sensitive, the very origin of human knowledge. On a high plain in Bolivia, more than 3,800 meters above sea level, from the sea, rests a set of ruins that defy any comfortable notion about old technology. There, close to Lake Titicaca, is Pumapunku, a archaeological that seems to have been forgotten by time, but not by perplexity. At first glance, they are just scattered stone blocks. But just look carefully to realize that something there doesn't fit. The stones are not irregular. They are accurate. Perfect right angles, millimeter cuts, flat surfaces as if they had been machined by modern machines. Some pieces fit together as if they were parts of a huge three-dimensional puzzle designed with mathematical rigor. The material used is andesite, an extremely hard volcanic rock. Even today, working this type of stone requires industrial tools with diamond tips. However, according to accepted chronology, Pumapunku would have been built by a civilization that did not yet had writing, advanced metallurgy, nor a functional wheel for heavy transport. And even so, there are blocks that weigh tens of tons, transported for kilometers, cut with surgical precision, and fitted together so perfectly that a razor blade can't fit between the joints. The traditional explanation tries to soften the impact. There is talk of stone hammers, sand abrasiveness, abundant time, and collective human strength. But when modern engineers they analyze the structures, something doesn't fit. The level of standardization suggests series production, exact repetition, as if there were molds or technical plans. I don't improvise. Some H-shaped blocks have internal channels, symmetrical holes, and recesses identical, as if they were designed to connect to other components. This raises a perplexing question. Connect for what? It's not just stones stacked, they are modular elements. And then there is silence again. Because accepting that Pumapunku required advanced tools implies admitting that the technological knowledge may have existed much earlier than we accept. Or worse, what was lost? There is something deeply symbolic about these ruins. They do not rise into the sky like pyramids. They seem disassembled, as if someone had interrupted the work or deliberately scattered the pieces. Some myths locals speak of a great catastrophe. Others say the gods walked there and they left, leaving everything behind. Science tends to ignore myths, but they carry cultural memory. And when myth and material evidence begins to touch, discomfort increases. Because Pumapunku doesn't, it looks like the beginning of an architectural tradition, but the end of it. We don't see evolution gradual. We see abrupt sophistication followed by abandonment. This goes against the idea of linear progress, suggests cycles, rise, peak, fall. Perhaps that civilization had access to techniques that did not survive the social collapse. climatic or symbolic, that destroyed it. Perhaps knowledge was concentrated in few experts, or perhaps it was never transmitted in writing, just by practice direct, which would make it extremely fragile over time. When we look at Pumapunku, we are not just looking at ancient stones, we are faced with a living question. As human beings, we have difficulty accepting that something SS to have been lost forever. We prefer to believe that we know more today, that we are the summit. But these ruins suggest something else. They suggest that human intelligence has flourished before, in different ways, with other priorities, other technologies, and other understandings of the physical world, and that neither everything that was created survived to be remembered. Perhaps the biggest mistake is to imagine that the past was simple. Maybe he was just silent. What if Pumapunku is just a fragment, a vestige of something greater, spread across other continents, waiting to be recognized as part of the same enigma? If this is true, the next impossible object may not be small or inconspicuous. It may be too big to continue being ignored. In the heart of New Delhi, amidst the historic Qutb Minar complex, a column stands that defies not only time but modern metallurgy itself. Known as the Iron Pillar of Delhi, this massive iron structure has more than 7 meters tall and weighs around 6 tons. What makes it truly impossible, it's not your size, it's your state. It doesn't rust. For more than 1,600 years exposed to rain, heat, pollution, and changes climate conditions, the column remains practically intact. No modern coatings, without chemical protection, just pure iron, erected in an era that, according to the books, was not mastered advanced metallic alloys. The studies revealed something surprising. The iron in the column has a composition unusual, rich in phosphorus and almost without sulfur or manganese. This combination created a microscopic passive layer that protects the metal from corrosion, an effect that engineers moderns only understood centuries later, with the development of the science of materials. But here the inevitable question arises. Was this chance or knowledge? The official explanation suggests that ancient Indian blacksmiths arrived at this composition by trial and error, accumulating empirical knowledge over generations. But this answer, although comfortable, it does not dispel the amazement. Because the precision required to repeat this result in such a large piece requires rigorous control of temperature, atmosphere, and process, something extremely difficult even today. We're not talking about a small blade. We're talking tons of iron cast, shaped, and erected to perfection. Sanskrit inscriptions indicate that the column was dedicated to a ruler, perhaps in 4th century AD, but they don't explain the how. They do not describe the method. They don't leave a manual sum, as if knowledge were so integrated into culture that it didn't need to be registered, or as if it were too restricted to be released. And then comes the unsettling contrast. During later centuries, the world lost the ability to reproduce something similar. Medieval European metallurgy struggled with rust, brittleness, and impurities. The secret seemed forgotten, as if a door had been closed. This leads us to an uncomfortable reflection on progress. Perhaps human advancement is not a continuous staircase, but a mosaic. Some pieces get lost. Others reappear under new names. Knowledge is not guaranteed. He is fragile. And it depends on social, cultural, and spiritual contexts to survive. When you look at the Iron Pillar, you are not just seeing a monument. Do you see a silent reminder that science does not belong to a specific era? She belongs to human curiosity. And this curiosity already fully existed in ancient civilizations. Here, it's worth a break. If something inside you is awakening, if these discoveries echo a feeling difficult to explain, stay until the end. Because the answer you seek may not be in a single object, but in the pattern that begins to form. The Iron Pillar forces us to accept an uncomfortable possibility. Our ancestors, perhaps, understood certain principles of nature in a more integrated way, less fragmented. They did not separate science, spirituality, and everyday practice as we do today. Everything was part of the same fabric, and perhaps for this reason, much was lost when this fabric was torn by wars, colonizations, dogmas, and oblivion. When knowledge stopped being lived and began to be compartmentalized. Imagine how many similar techniques have disappeared, how many alloys, processes, methods, and intuitions have been erased without leaving physical traces as resistant as this pillar. He remains there, motionless, as generations pass by, a silent testimony of a past that does not ask to be glorified, only understood. He doesn't scream ancient superiority. It whispers modern humility. If we accept that ancient civilizations mastered techniques that we are only now beginning to fully understand, then we need to review our relationship with time. The past stops being a place of ignorance and becomes a reservoir of possibilities forgotten. And perhaps the most important question is not how they achieved it, but why do we forget? Because if we forget that, what else do we leave behind without realizing it? The next impossible object may not be made of stone or metal. It may be made of something even more delicate, knowledge that has almost disappeared. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis presented the world with something that only would become truly disturbing centuries later. At first glance, it was just a map, ancient, drawn on parchment, showing parts of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But the more experts studied it, the more the feeling of displacement in time intensified. The map, now preserved in Topkapi Palace, showed the coast of South America with a precision that did not match the 16th century. Detailed shorelines, proportions surprisingly correct. But what really baffled the researchers came then. The representation of a continental mass to the south, very similar to Antarctica. The problem is simple and devastating for traditional chronology. Antarctica was only officially discovered in 1820, and even more important, its contour. The real reality could only be mapped in the 20th century, with the use of satellites and radars capable of seeing through the ice. However, the Piri Reis map appears to depict this land without ice. How would this be possible? When questioned, Piri Reis himself left clues. In notes on the map, he stated having compiled his work from much older sources, legacy maps, letters, nautical boats of unknown origins, records that, according to him, went back to the time of Alexander the Great, and even before. Here the story starts to get unsettling, because if these sources really existed, someone mapped the world in the past remote with a level of precision that would only reappear thousands of years later. This suggests not only advanced navigation but also mathematical and geodetic knowledge sophisticated, something that would require understanding the curvature of the Earth and projection techniques, complex cartography. During the 20th century, researchers analyzed the map using modern methods. They found that it appeared to have been drawn from an elevated aerial perspective, something impossible without flight technology, or an extremely advanced. Additionally, certain proportions indicate the use of a global grid, as if the planet had been mapped as a whole. The Academy's reaction was cautious. Some said it was just a coincidence. Others have suggested interpretations exaggerated, but no explanation could completely eliminate the discomfort, because the map is not an isolated piece. It joins other ancient records that they seem to carry echoes of forgotten global knowledge. An essential reflection arises here. Maps are not just drawings. They are syntheses of accumulated knowledge. For exist, require observation, measurement, comparison, and transmission of data over a period of time, generations. The Piri Reis map, therefore, not only points to a genius man, but to a tradition that preceded him. What if this tradition belonged to a much older civilization, a culture that explored the oceans when we believe that humans barely dominated agriculture? A previous humanity perhaps erased by catastrophes, global events, climate change, or events that fragmented collective memory. This idea is uncomfortable because it affects our identity. We prefer to see ourselves as the first to understand the planet on a global scale. How do the ultimate trailblazers? But the map suggests someone has done this before and disappeared. There is also a deeply symbolic aspect to this impossible object. The map does not show only land. It shows absence, memory gaps, continents of knowledge submerged by time, just as Antarctica was submerged by ice. Perhaps ancient knowledge was not destroyed all at once. Perhaps it has been fragmented, diluted, transformed into myths, legends, and symbols. And only small fragments like this map survived by chance. Waiting for the modern technology was finally able to recognize its strangeness. The Piri Reis map does not require us to accept extravagant theories. He demands something more difficult: Historical humility. Acceptance that we don't know everything. From that, human history can have entire chapters ripped out, not by conspiracy, but by fragility. Because knowledge, contrary to what we imagine, is not eternal. He needs to be remembered, taught, and protected. When a civilization falls, its maps get lost, their libraries burn, your roots disappear, and then, centuries later, someone finds a fragment, and you don't know how to fit it anymore. If the Piri race map is an echo of a forgotten world, it leaves us with a question that echoes with increasing force. How many other pieces of the puzzle are scattered around, waiting for us to set aside comfortable certainties to really see? Maybe the next impossible object. Don't show us a tool or a material strange. Perhaps it will show us something even more disturbing, that we have been here before, and we forget. In 1898, during excavations in a tomb in Egypt, archaeologists found an object small, fragile, and seemingly insignificant. Made of wood about 15 centimeters long, it was catalogued as a simple stylized bird. Nothing more. A ritual toy, perhaps. The artifact was kept in a Cairo museum and almost forgotten. But time, once again, had other plans. The object became known as the Saqqara bird, found in the Saqqara necropolis and dating from approximately 200 BC. For decades, no one questioned its classification, until someone decided to look with different eyes, not as an archaeologist, but as engineer. The shape was not that of an ordinary bird. The wings were rigid, symmetrical, slightly inclined. The tail was vertical, something non-existent in birds, but essential in modern aircraft for directional stability. There were no feathers. There were no decorative details, just form and function. When the object was analyzed under aerodynamic principles, discomfort emerged. That structure did not seem symbolic. It looked functional. Engineers built larger-scale replicas of the model, tested in tunnels wind, adjusted the center of mass, and the result was unsettling. With small corrections, the model glided. Stable, controllable, it didn't flap its wings, but it flew. Here, the inevitable question arises. Why would someone in ancient Egypt build a working aerodynamic model? The traditional explanation runs under the shelter of symbolism. It says that the object would represent a sacred falcon associated with the god Horus. But that doesn't explain the lack of details, religious beliefs, nor structural precision. Symbolic cultures often exaggerate traits divine. The Saqqara bird does the opposite. It simplifies, eliminates the superfluous, preserves only the necessary. This is not common in ritual art. It's common in engineering. Once again, the official narrative opts for elegant silence. The object does not appear in books didactic. It is rarely mentioned in Egyptology courses. It exists, but it is not integrated, as if it were easier to ignore than explain. But think for a moment. Ancient Egypt mastered mathematics, astronomy, hydraulics, and architecture at levels extraordinary. They aligned pyramids with near-perfect accuracy to true north. They calculated colossal volumes. They planned structures that resisted for millennia. Why would the idea of flight experimentation be impossible for them? Maybe we won't talk about manned planes. Maybe we'll talk about experimental gliders, observation models, devices, ceremonials that imitated something real, or even scientific toys used to understand the behavior of air and wind. Human curiosity does not need jet engines to begin with. Here, the reflection deepens. History tends to associate flight with the myth of Icarus, as if it were just a poetic dream. But what if, behind the myth, there was real experimentation, attempts, failures, apprenticeship? The myth would only be the symbolic memory of something concrete. The Saqqara bird confronts us with an uncomfortable idea. Perhaps ancient knowledge was more experimental than we believe, less tied to dogma, more open to observation direct from nature. They saw birds, felt the wind, tested shapes. They didn't need call it science and practice it. What if this object is just a fragment of a larger tradition? Models that did not survive, experiments that failed, attempts that were abandoned when other priorities emerged. The flight, after all, was not necessary to immediate survival. But curiosity, yes. There is something deeply human in this gesture, creating something that serves not a basic need, but a desire to understand. From imitate nature, to touch the impossible, even if for a second. The Saqqara bird does not prove that the Egyptians flew in the sky, but it proves something perhaps more important. They thought beyond the floor. And that brings us to a question that echoes with increasing force throughout this video. How many old ideas were abandoned not because of impossibility, but because of choice? How many paths of knowledge were left aside because the world followed another direction? Perhaps human history is not just a line of progress, but a garden of trails interrupted. Some resumed centuries later, others forgotten forever. If a small wooden object managed to cross 2 millennia carrying this silent doubt, imagine what could still be buried, not just under the sand, but under our certainties. And perhaps the next impossible object won't just challenge old technology. Perhaps it challenges something even more intimate, our idea of human limits. Among all the impossible objects ever discovered, few provoke such fascination as the crystal skulls. Carved and transparent quartz, they appear in different collections around the world, each with the same unsettling aura. The most famous of these is known as the Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull, and he not only intrigues, he challenges. At first glance, it just looks like a detailed sculpture, a perfectly human skull reproduced in solid quartz crystal. But when experts began to study it with modern instruments, discomfort set in. The skull was carved into a single block of quartz, an extremely hard material, just below diamond on the resistance. And the strangest thing? It was carved against the natural axis of the crystal. For those who work with minerals, this is almost unthinkable. Quartz has internal lines that, if disrespected, cause the material to break. Still thus, the skull was molded with microscopic precision. Movable jaw, surfaces optically polished, internal details that refract light in a complex way, creating visual effects that seem intentional. According to the traditional narrative, the skull would have Mesoamerican origin, associated with cultures pre-Columbian. But here the problem arises. No known tool like this civilizations would be able to produce such a finish, not even with centuries of work manual. Studies indicate that, if it were done only with natural abrasives, the process it would take hundreds of years of continuous polishing. And yet, there are no tool marks, no scratches, no imperfections compatible with primitive techniques. Some museums, such as the British Museum, have similar skulls and claim that they are 19th century forgeries. But even these analyses don't explain everything, because even with modern technology, reproduce an identical skull with the same optical properties and internal precision is still a considerable technical challenge. Here, the object becomes a mirror. It reflects not just light, but our own interpretive limitations. If it is old, it suggests lost technical mastery. If it is modern, it suggests a level of skill that has not been documented. In both cases, something doesn't add up. There is also the symbolic side. The human skull has always represented knowledge, memory, and consciousness. In several ancient cultures, the skull was seen as a container of the soul, the spirit, the essence. Create a crystal skull, a material associated with clarity, energy, and permanence. It seems to carry an intention that goes beyond the aesthetic. Some traditions claim that these skulls were used as ceremonial objects. Others talk about knowledge storage, stories that science discards quickly but which persist because something about these objects provokes a visceral reaction. They don't look decorative. They seem deliberate. When scientists analyzed how light behaves inside the skull, they realized that it works almost like an optical system. Light enters, refracts, travels internal paths, and emerges in a concentrated way, as if the object was designed to interact with human perception, not just to be seen, but to be experienced. This raises a profound question. And if certain ancient objects were not only made to fulfill practical functions, but to elicit specific mental states, to impress, to teach, for transform. Modern archaeology tends to separate matter from meaning, but maybe civilizations ancients did not make this distinction. Technology, spirituality, and psychology could coexist in the same artifact. An object could be, at the same time, a tool and a symbol. The crystal skull remains in a liminal zone. It is not fully accepted. It is not fully refuted. It exists in the uncomfortable space between what we know and what we would rather not explore. And perhaps that is exactly where its importance lies. Because impossible objects do not appear to give us ready-made answers. They arise to test the limits of the questions we are willing to ask. The crystal skull does not prove a lost advanced civilization, but he proves something more subtle and equally disturbing. Our difficulty in dealing with the inexplicable without reducing or discarding it. He reminds us that the past was not just functional. It was symbolic, intentional, deeply human. Perhaps these objects are not asking us to believe in extraordinary narratives. Perhaps they are asking for something simpler and more difficult, that we accept not knowing everything, what human history still has shadow areas, and that these shadows are not empty. They are dense with meaning. If we've come this far, we're no longer just talking about gears, maps, stones, or metals. We talk about a pattern, an invisible thread connecting impossible objects over time. One persistent whisper saying that the past was deeper than we have learned. And now, there is only one last step left. Not to find another object, but to look at them all together and ask what they're really trying to do us remember. We have reached the end of this journey, but perhaps not the end of the question. Along the way, we saw gears where there shouldn't be machines, electricity where there shouldn't be energy, maps of still unknown lands, carved stones with impossible precision, metals that defy time, shapes that suggest flight, and objects that seem to speak directly to human consciousness. Separated, they are anomalies. Together, they form a pattern, and standards call for silence before interpretation. Perhaps the biggest mistake is trying to fit these objects into quick responses. They were not made for this. They exist as reminders that human history is not just a sequence of dates, but a living memory, full of gaps, losses, and relearning. O past is not dead. He just speaks quietly. There is something deeply spiritual about this realization, the idea that knowledge does not belong to an era, but to the human condition itself. That curiosity, observation, and the desire to understand the universe have always been gifts. Sometimes they flourished. Sometimes they were interrupted. But they never disappeared completely. Perhaps we are not the first civilization to look to the sky with questions. Maybe we'll just be the next to remember. If this message touched something inside you, don't ignore it. Stay alert. Why, when we begin to realize that the past is more complex than we have been told, something it also changes in the present. We become more humble, more curious, more open to mystery. If you feel like this journey has awakened something dormant, sign up and follow along with us. Not out of habit, but out of continuity. Because this is not a channel about answers. Absolute. It is a space for questions that deserve time, silence, and depth. And before you go, take this last thought with you. What if what we call advancement is just a slow return to knowledge that humanity has had, but you still don't remember completely? Maybe the end was never an end. Perhaps it is just the beginning of a memory that the soul has not yet forgotten.